Great Power, Chapter 9, Super Nanny. That night was an interesting one for Piper and her friends. They had been invited to stay over at Avengers Tower, though the boys would be staying on Captain America's level, while Ava stayed in one of the spare rooms on Piper's level. They all had breakfast together and told an altered version of events to Tony, who hovered by Piper's shoulder the whole time and fussed. Eddie and MJ had been invited to the tower. Harry would have been too, but no one could seem to get a hold of him. It worried Piper, but everyone else was so happy, she tried to ignore it. She tried to ignore the feeling in her gut that something wasn't right. They all had school the next day, so after a brief argument with Tony that yes, Piper did have to go to school today, even if both of them would rather work on figuring out how the time difference between Asgard and Earth worked, and if they could figure out where exactly it lay in the universe due to that, she left. Natasha decided that she was going to drive them to school, all of them, in the van Tony never used. She dropped them off at the back of the building, and they were rushed into the building by one of the plainclothes S.H.I.E.L.D. officers that S.H.I.E.L.D. had disguised as security officers when the team had begun to go to Midtown High. They were early, the halls eerily empty as they were rushed into Principal Coulson's office. There were 5 chairs waiting in the room, in front of the desk, the chair of which was facing the window. The door was closed behind them, and they each took a seat. Once they were seated, the chair spun around to reveal Agent Coulson sitting there, hands steepled in front of him. Piper couldn't read his expression. Ava was looking down at her feet. Sam's feet were twitching. Luke was staring resolutely out the window to his left. Danny looked calm, but he always looked calm. Piper turned back to Coulson, who laid his hands down on his desk and stood. He came out from behind his desk and leaned on the corner closest to Ava. "Tell me what really happened." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. None of the other teens looked like they wanted to speak, so Piper began the story. She told him everything up until Sam had followed her out onto the balcony at the party. She hesitated, but Ava, who was looking more and more nervous by the minute, spoke. Sam and Piper almost kissed. Sam made a noise at the back of his throat that was somewhere between a protest and a confirmation. Piper rolled her eyes. It kind of boggled her mind that Ava could face down bad guys like Wizard, but was terrified of Agent Coulson. She couldn't see how he could be intimidating as he kept leaning on his desk for a moment. Then he spoke. "None of you are hurt? That's good." He stepped again, so he was standing in front of his desk, directly in front of the teens. "You were all thrown into a situation that none of you were prepared for. Facing an enemy who has proven to be someone that even the Avengers struggled to take down." There was a pause. Then the unthinkable happened. He smiled. "You all did well. Much better than I would have expected anyone your age or with your level of training to do. I'll be placing commendations in all your files, as will Director Fury. It's going to take some time for the press to calm down about this. S.H.I.E.L.D. will be taking the brunt of the questioning and answering them for you, in the name of keeping your superhero and civilian identities separate. I can't promise no paparazzi will be waiting in places that we don't think of, but we're going to do our best." The others glanced at each other, clearly confused, but happy. "Now, Luke, Danny, Ava, head to class. I need to have words with Sam and Piper." The 3 teens paused, but did as they were ordered. Coulson walked back around his desk to sit back in his chair. "I need to warn the 2 of you to be careful. Relationships make being a hero complicated. You 2 know this better than most. Sometimes there are choices you have to be made to save the world instead of each other." Sam flinched. "Sometimes the world will target one to get to the other." It was Piper's turn to flinch. Just a little over a year ago, Pepper had been taken by Aldrich Killian and almost killed. Jarvis hadn't let Piper access the suits to go after them, so to help, so she had gone out as Spider-Girl for the first time, in a hoodie and leggings, a red ski mask, and yellow goggles. It hadn't been her best idea, but she'd upgraded quickly. Coulson nodded. "Just be careful. Sam, you head out. I need to talk to Piper." Sam reached over and gently squeezed her hand, and she smiled at him as he left. Then she turned back to Coulson, her expression hardening. He sighed and pulled 2 things from his desk. One was a box, the other a folder. "I have noticed over the past few months that you've become more distant, more hostile towards S.H.I.E.L.D. agents who aren't your team. At first, I put it down to being protective, but I decided to do some digging anyway. It is my job, after all. He set the folder in front of her. It had the SHIELD logo on it, but was otherwise plain, if overly full. How much did you know about what your parents did for a living? Piper went pale and shook her head, confused. Was Coulson offering her this information freely? Coulson nodded, apparently expecting that kind of reaction. At the time of their deaths, they were heading to a rendezvous point in Leipzig, Germany. With them, they had 3 witnesses, Drs. Carl and Jamie Brock, and a Dr. Otto Octavius, all of whom worked at Oscorp at the time. They had been sent in to investigate some suspicious activity, disturbing rumors of unchecked human experimentation, attempts to recreate the super soldier serum. They were supposed to meet up with a more experienced field agent, Maria Hill, when they arrived, but they never made it to Germany, as you well know. He opened the file as Piper was still sitting stock still. This is every scrap of information I could find on your parents, both from their assignment at Oscorp and before. Everything from field reports to requisition forms, every scrap of paperwork they ever made while at SHIELD. He closed the folder and stood, stepping over to her. He picked up the folder off the desk and handed it to her. She stared at him. Her breath was shaking. He laid one hand on hers. I know this information can be shocking, but you deserve the truth, the whole truth, and I wish I could give that to you, but this is all I can give. This and the knowledge that there is another piece of the puzzle out there somewhere. 2, really. Your parents had a SHIELD drive, an older model. It doesn't have tracking in it, and they had a briefcase in their possession on the plane when they died. There's record of them reporting to Agent Hill that they had it before they boarded the plane. But it was gone when SHIELD arrived on the scene, along with a few bodies, including that of Dr. Octavius. We've been keeping an ear to the ground for him for years, but there's never been so much as a whisper. Piper hugged the folder to herself, her parents' lives reduced to so much paper. She sniffled, and Coulson pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it over to her. She scrubbed at her eyes and blew her nose. He smiled slightly as she managed a strained smile. He crossed back behind his desk and pulled the box to the center of the wooden surface. Piper frowned. What's that? Coulson sighed. Something Dr. Connors thinks you can help with. I'm not sure if anyone's told you yet, but no one's heard from Harry Osborn in 3 days. Piper almost dropped the file in her arms. Coulson tapped the mat on his desk, which lit up and projected a newscast picturing Backtrock being loaded into an ambulance. The reporter was speaking. This is the latest in a series of brutal attacks seemingly perpetrated by the Spider-Girl, though when questioned, most describe a hulking black figure, a far cry from the lovable red and blue spider many in New York are coming to call one of our greatest heroes. Coulson clicked off the newscast. That's been happening since you went missing, but Harry was still showing up for school. Looking a bit worse for the wear, but not as bad as he was right after Venom took him over. We were able to keep an eye on him for a while, but 2 days ago he didn't show up. Even we can't find him. Piper frowned and set down the folder. Yeah, spiders are pretty good at hiding. Coulson nodded. That's what we were thinking, but we have a spider smarter than Venom and Harry Osborn combined. He pushed the box across to her. Figure it out. Piper snagged the sealed box from the desk and stuffed it into her bag as the bell rang for the start of school day. She could already tell it was going to be a long one. Chapter 10, Blood of My Blood. Sam was waiting for her outside Coulson's office. They held hands on the way to class. Piper heard whispers behind their backs, but she didn't care. The day went by fast, and Piper and Ava had picked a fight with each other so Piper could get an early detention. She needed her lab on the helicarrier. She pulled the box Coulson had given her out of her backpack as she reached her lab. She pulled her mask up above her mouth and used her teeth to pull off her gloves. She laid her hand on the scanner and the box, and the door to her lab slid open. She set down the box and gently pulled the box of samples that was carefully nestled inside out. 4 deep red blood samples rested inside. Piper couldn't help but feel they were darker than they should have been. But she set that thought aside for the moment and set to work. Hours later, she was really beginning to wish she had a real sample of Venom to work with. Nothing was working. She was starting to get desperate. The DNA tracker Shield normally used to track people wasn't working with Harry, and no one could figure out why. But she had a theory. Maybe Venom had altered his DNA somehow. She'd have to dig deep into his genetic code to figure out what was really going on. She had to run one of the samples through the DNA sequencer a few times before she spotted it. She blinked at the results in front of her. That couldn't be right. She grabbed another sample. She knew she was running short of time, but she needed to know if this was right. She blinked as the same results popped up again. She ran all 4 samples through the sequencer. When all 4 came out with the same results, she swore loudly. Sam popped his head into Piper's lab and frowned. She glanced up. Her mask was pulled over her nose and mouth, but her mouth was full, a still-capped syringe between her teeth. She looked back down at her arm where she was tying off a tourniquet. She tapped her arm looking for a suitable vein, and he noticed that her sleeve was rolled up to her shoulder. She uncapped the syringe and carefully pulled it out of her mouth before plunging it into her vein. Sam went pale. "Come in or close the door, Nova." He stepped into the room, and the door slipping closed behind him, his eyes avoiding the syringe as Piper pulled up the plunger. The body of the syringe filled with red, and she carefully pulled the needle out of her arm. She turned back to her table, ignoring the blood that seeped out from the small puncture wound on her arm. Sam sighed and grabbed a cotton pad out of one of the cabinets and gently took her arm. He was surprised she let him, but she did as she kept working. "What are you up to?" Piper shook her head. "Later. I need to see if this works." The door to the lab slid open, again revealing Dr. Connors holding a sealed containment unit in his hands. "Got what you asked for, Spider-Girl?" Piper nodded and took the containment unit. There was already a sample in the machine she'd rigged up on her table. It was about 4 feet across and held all 4 samples Dr. Connors had given her. "And these are all the post-venom samples we have of Harry's blood?" Dr. Connors nodded, and Piper took the samples of her blood to the DNA sequencer. She slipped it in and muttered under her breath, Come on, come on." The machine beeped and displayed the results. She split the screen and pulled up another screen of results from the machine, though this one seemed to be from 2 different samples. She pulled the second of the sequences up and compared them to hers. She swore and popped open the containment unit. She quickly slipped Harry's blood samples into the unit and resealed it before hooking up her machine. Sam was starting to get worried. "What's wrong?" Piper glanced at him, her still visible mouth pulled down in a frown. "I'm right." Sam laughed. "Since when is that a bad thing?" Piper turned back to her machine and flicked it on, sending waves of increasing electricity into the samples of Harry's blood. It took a minute, but soon they began to shake. Sam was about to pull Piper out of the way of what he was sure was about to be a pile of exploding glass, but then he noticed that the samples were shaking in different directions. He stared as the glass around the samples shattered and the liquid inside, which was growing darker by the minute, began to try and claw its way out of the containment unit, which luckily held. "I didn't want to be right." Dr. Connors stared. "That shouldn't be possible. He was clean. We checked." Piper nodded. "You checked once, maybe twice. You didn't think of the nooks and crannies spiders hide in." Sam raised an eyebrow under his helmet. "I mean, I know Venom possessed you at one point, but it didn't use spidery powers with anyone but you and Harry." Piper shook her head. "You don't get it, Sam. Venom, whatever made it, they had a piece of me, probably a blood sample." She turned the display she'd been swearing at to the other 2 in the room. The DNA sequences were an exact match. "That means that Venom is part of me." That statement hung in the air for a long time as Sam and Dr. Connors stared at the screen in front of them.